Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Now, I know Ned can hear me. Listen, my name is Kelly Persons, and I'm the Executive Director of the Nova Foundation. Now, I have a very quick favor to ask all of you before I introduce my colleague, Provost Annette Hagray. And that favor is a photo op. So, if everyone could hold up their book, we have two amazing, way up, come on gang, way up. And we have two amazing volunteer student photographers who are also military affiliated. Let them get several shots, because we thought this, oh, look, General Petraeus has got his, I love it. This is gonna be a great night. Okay, thank you so very much. It is now my pleasure to introduce Provost Annette Hagray.
Thank you, Kelly. And good evening, and welcome to Northern Virginia Community College, the largest public institution of higher education in Northern Virginia. And welcome to the Alexandria campus, where I have the pleasure of serving as provost. We are honored to have you on our campus tonight, and in particular in this auditorium, the Barbara A. Wiles Auditorium. We're excited to have you with us tonight for the book discussion with General Petraeus. And General Petraeus, we thank you immensely for your service to our country. I'd like to share with you that NOVA has a long history of providing educational services for military-affiliated students. And this might be of interest to you. As of June 23, 8% or over 6,400 members of our student body are active duty personnel, veterans, or military dependents. That's a significant number. And we are also pleased at this campus to support 2,100 military and veteran affiliated students. So we're pleased to have those students supported on our campus. Thanks to a grant from the Department of Education, NOVA created the Center of Excellence for Veteran Student Success. And this center offers comprehensive centralized support for student veterans. It provides a wide range of services to assist students with transition, enrollment, persistence, retention, and completion. And that is so important for us to see students through that entire series of steps in the educational process. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to the 6th president of Northern Virginia Community College, Dr. Ann Kress. A champion for community colleges, NOVA is fortunate to benefit from Dr. Kress's 3 decades of higher education experience, and I would add leadership. A champion for community colleges, truly a champion. She takes her role in leading our community's college to heart by serving on both national and regional boards, including the American Council on Education, the Global Community College Leadership Network, Leadership Greater Washington, Generation Hope, Capital Area Food Bank, the Northern Virginia Chamber, Northern Virginia Technology Council, Go Virginia Region 7, and the Consortium of the Universities of the Washington Metro area. Please help me welcome Dr. Ann Kress.
Thank you very, very much. Please join me in thanking Provost Hagray for hosting us here on the campus this evening. So I am so grateful to all of you for joining us for this incredible conversation. I just feel so privileged to be here. General Petraeus, I have to share, General Petraeus and his wife are in some ways coming back to NOVA because they are NOVA parents, right? Both of their children at various points in their journeys attended NOVA. So we're very proud to claim them as alumni. It is also incredible that the General and his wife, at their encouragement, really thought about how they could give back to NOVA And so the proceeds from this event will be supporting our Student Success Fund, which was launched in October. The Student Success Fund addresses the emergency needs of NOVA students, making sure that they don't fall off the pathway to graduation and their pathway to success. The fund launched just in October and already has distributed over $170,000 in emergency aid to more than 200 students in need. I am very grateful to our sponsors for this evening, DSI Tech and Northrop Grumman, for helping to support the fund by their sponsorship of this event, but also many of you who made it possible for our military-affiliated students to attend this evening's event and receive an autographed copy of the book. Thank you very, very much. So why is this important to us? Well, this week I was in Richmond, and I was accompanied by our board chair, others, and a couple students. One of them, Andrew, is a Marine Corps veteran. So when he exited the Marine Corps, Andrew wasn't sure what he wanted to do with his life. He found his way to NOVA. He found his way to our incredibly supportive folks in Veteran Services, who he couldn't say enough about. They connected him to what he found was his passion, which is automotive technology. So Andrew, who is now the proud father of an adorable 6-month-old girl, who he had lots of photos of, is able to find a stronger financial future. He can build a new life for his growing family thanks to our staff and thanks to the incredible professors in our automotive technology program, who really have helped him in so many ways beyond the classroom. That's what makes NOVA different. That's what makes NOVA special. We are a military-friendly college and have been designated in that vein since 2011, but it goes beyond that. It's about caring for student success, right? NOVA's mission is about providing equitable and affordable access to exceptional higher education and workforce programs. We are able to do that because of our incredible faculty and staff who every day meet our inspiring students where they are and help them find where they can, should, and will be. Right? That journey is what your attendance here is helping to support. I also want to thank some folks who are joining us here this evening. Right? We have a number of members of our board, including our board chair, Ambassador Joseph Huggins. We also have board members John Porter and Raj Chand in the audience who are joining us. We have from our foundation board, John Clark, and we also have, I believe, our board chair emeritus, Susanna Steen, joining us here. So I want to thank all of them for joining us at tonight's conversation. And I also want to thank the incredible NOVA students that you probably saw on your way in for helping you with the wayfinding. I hope you saw how excited they are about NOVA as well. So please join me in applauding our volunteers, everyone who helped make this evening possible, and certainly General Petraeus. So now I would like to introduce our board chair and moderator for this evening, Ambassador Joseph Huggins. Ambassador Huggins is a career diplomat who retired from federal service in 2006. He had a long and distinguished career in diplomatic service, serving in mid and senior level positions in the former Soviet Union, Kenya, Guinea, Togo, and Jordan. In Washington, he worked on issues related to Africa, South Asia, and the Middle East. In his last overseas assignment, from November 2002 to July 2005, he served as ambassador to the Republic of Botswana and the Secretary of State's special representative to the Southern Africa Development Community, a political and economic organization comprised of 14 countries in Southern Africa. He is the founder, president, and chief executive officer of the Huggins Group, LLC, which provides intelligence research to U.S. companies, interested in trade and investment opportunities in Africa and the Middle East. Most importantly to all of us, he is an amazing board chair who is dedicated to the success of NOVA students. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Huggins and in as he begins this amazing and fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Dr. Chris. I am honored to be here tonight serving as the moderator for this book discussion with General Petraeus. My job tonight is to lead the discussion with the General, followed by a question and answer period. Prior to this event, we invited guests and NOVA students to submit questions for General to respond to. David Howell Petraeus is a former director of the Central Intelligence Agency with an impressive 37-year career as an officer in the United States Army. Now let me provide you with some of the highlights of his illustrious military career. He earned the General George C. Marshall Award as the top graduate of the U.S. Army Command and General Staff College, class of 1983. Was military assistant to the Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO, was an aide to the Army Chief of Staff, served as a brigade or battalion commander in both the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions. General Petraeus also served as the Assistant Chief of Staff for military operations of the NATO Stabilization Force in Bosnia, was commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division, leading them into battle during the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq. He served as commander of the Multinational Security Transition Command in Iraq, commander of all coalition forces in Iraq, commander-in-chief of Central Command, and was commander of U.S. and NATO forces in Afghanistan when he retired from the Army. Now, while we think of him as a military leader, he is also an academic, earning both a Master of Public Administration degree and PhD in International Relations from Princeton University. He taught social sciences at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point and completed a military fellowship at Georgetown University's Edmund A. Walsh School of Foreign Service. He has also taught at Macaulay Honors College at the City University of New York and the University of Southern California. Now, General, I know you're a busy educator, but if you have time, I believe we can find you a space here at NOVA.
Yale might take issue with that.
As we begin this discussion, I want to talk about something that you and I have in common, General Petraeus. Both you and I are proud NOVA parents. My daughter graduated from NOVA, then went on to George Mason for her bachelor's and master's degree. My son, on the other hand, attended Marymount for 1 year, got religion, came to NOVA, completed 1 year, and then went off to Mason to get his bachelor's in international relations, and is now considering law school. Now let's talk about your connection to NOVA.
Well, thank you very much. Reminds me of the time that we had the most anticipated hearing of a military commander in many, many decades. At least that's how the Washington Post and New York Times saw it. It was the 6-month mark of the surge. The entire well of the floor of the House Armed Services Committee was full of photographers. I had the pink ladies demonstrating behind me. It was a charged atmosphere. They went through the initial statements by the chairman and the ranking member, and they turned to me and they said, "Now, General Petraeus, if you will provide your opening statement." I leaned forward, I pressed the button, and the microphone did not work. Look, first of all, let me just say thanks so much for doing this, and thanks, by the way, Major General John Ferrara, who's one of the really great Army officers of our time in recent decades, who connected us, working on your staff, I know, Madam President. So it's great to do this. It is really impressive to see your leadership. By the way, I'm going to talk later about strategic leadership, I'm sure. And the first task of a strategic leader is to get the big ideas right. And I wrote down what your big ideas are: to provide equitable, affordable access to, I think it's a wide array of course offerings. That's a pretty good big idea. And it's very clear from the interaction I've had with you that you are a very impressive strategic leader. And the provosts who are, I know there are some other provosts here as well, so I won't talk anything about this being potentially the flagship campus. But you know, what an incredible resource for Northern Virginia. 70,000 students across 6 campuses. And as you noted, indeed, our son, who we moved by the way, this is my first time on campus, because when our kids actually were taking courses here, I was deployed the entire time. But our son, we moved him 3 times in 4 years of high school. I'd gone back for the 3-star tour in Iraq unexpectedly. My wife ended up at Fort Belvoir. There was no other place, needed security. He couldn't go to the schools he probably would have gone. He was a National Merit Scholarship winner, very, very gifted student. And so she found him a place at West Potomac. They said, you know, you're sort of out of classes for you here, so why don't we just send you to Nova at least 3 days a week? And so we allowed him to use the family Plymouth Voyager, quite a stylish car, I always thought. And 3 days a week he came over and took classes here, and we're grateful for that. And he then, by the way, subsequently went on to MIT and also did a number of tours in Afghanistan after that. And then our daughter, who decided she wanted to pursue graduate study in a field that had not been her major as an undergraduate, needed some prerequisite courses, and also took advantage of Nova. So, you know, when you think about what this does in terms of trade skills, as you mentioned, for the former Marine, upskilling, reskilling, all of these hugely important to our economic future in the United States. The first step towards a bachelor and a master's degree or PhD, as your children have demonstrated, Ambassador. Hugely important and great how much you do for those who are in the military, who are veterans of military service, family members, dependents, and so forth. All very, very special. And Ambassador, before we go further, thanks for your decades of service to our country as one of our senior diplomats during that time. So that's how, again, I got acquainted with Nova and realized its value, and now it's great to set foot on Nova after our kids have done that many, many times.
All right, thank you very much, General. You have a unique perspective on warfare. You have the hands-on and on-the-ground experience as a leader in combat, and the theoretical understanding of war from your academic training. What prompted you to write this book at this time?
Well, it's a great question. I'd actually been looking for an opportunity to write about Iraq and Vietnam, and actually in Afghanistan, also to revisit my dissertation at Princeton was on the American military and the lessons of Vietnam, but I wrote it at the 10-year mark, and several decades had gone by since then, and I was keen to look at what had been written. I'd obviously dipped into it from time to time, but that was also something I was eager to do. Writing about Iraq and Afghanistan, I didn't want to do some kind of tell-all memoir. There was a great market for that, by the way. One of my agents was all over me about that. I said, I just want to do the military history and not all the other components that you guys would want to sell books. And Andrew Roberts, my co-author, who's now also Lord Roberts of Belgravia, he was given a peerage during the process of this book. This is his 20th book. He'd never had a co-author before. We know each other very, very well. We've done a number of events together over the years on his Churchill book, his George III book, The Last King of America, and a number of, he's a delightful individual. He's a prodigious producer of written works. He wrote the best single volume on Churchill, great biography of Napoleon, by the way. He has a very dim view of the movie, I might add. Masters and Commanders, all of these, again, over the years. And a great guy. He's also sort of unique. Certainly, I could never do. He's one of these individuals who can actually drink and still go on stage and be coherent, which is something I would never to try. But he called me up when the Russians invaded Ukraine, and he said, you know, there should be a military historical context for this war. It doesn't exist. Would you be interested in writing it with me? And I jumped at the chance. We pitched it, used his agent, got a very wonderful advance and so forth. By the way, that's going to go to, all the profits are going to veterans causes and so forth. So we had a great collaboration. It was really delightful. Wonderful book tours is still sort of going on, candidly. This week alone has been Toronto, Miami, New York, and then here, and then tomorrow downtown. A wonderful experience, frankly. And, you know, keep in mind that in Iraq, for example, I was literally in the invasion. I came right back pretty quickly as a 3-star, had about a 15-month break during which we wrote the counterinsurgency field manual, then went back and actually got to implement it as the overall commander. Then it was a central command in charge of the greater Middle East, year break over in Afghanistan, and then CIA director, which was still right up until we had our final combat forces withdrawn. So that whole episode, and what's interesting is the editor, when we turned in those chapters, you know, they were sort of the traditional third person, which is how you write history. And the editor said, this doesn't work. You need to do it in the first person, put a little asterisk up there. It said you drafted it, which is what I did. And then also did it Vietnam, and then Andrew largely did the rest, although thousands, tens of thousands actually of emails back and forth. By the way, before I forget, I also want to note, I think the West Point Society of DC or Northern Virginia or the greater metro area may be in here. And could I ask them to stand up just quickly if they are here? If they're, certainly Mike Mises, surely. I hope you're a member of that, Mike. Thank you so much. And I might just single out, there's a few folks in here who, you know, they've been fellow travelers on this. Mike Mies, for example, was with me in Bosnia, which you didn't mention as well, another great experience. 2-star, 3-star, and 4-star in Iraq, and then even, he had a great sabbatical. He was the head of the Department of Social Sciences at West Point. And he told me, I've got this great sabbatical coming up. I said, super, why don't you spend it in Afghanistan? Which he did as the Deputy Chief of Staff of the International Security Assistance Force. So thanks yet again, Mike, for all you did. And John, likewise, my friend.
All right, thank you very much. As a follow-up to that question, what, if anything, was the most interesting piece of information that you discovered while researching the book, specifically regarding any preconceived notions that you may have had about previous conflicts?
Well, revisiting Vietnam was interesting. I'd actually looked at Vietnam when I was doing my dissertation with respect to how it influenced military advice on the use of force. I was doing that deliberately. By the way, for any of the students or others in here, anytime you're going to pick a topic for a senior thesis or a dissertation or something like that, make sure it is something that will provide you intellectual capital for positions down the road. And I deliberately, I said, you know what, I could actually be somebody in a senior position someday giving the president advice on the use of force, or at least I'd already been, and I had not yet actually worked for the Supreme Allied Commander, the Chief of Staff, or the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I was also his exec for 2 years. It was hugely valuable. I mean, he's the guy giving advice. So I was not the guy, but I was sort of at his right hand. And I thought if I am fortunate enough to have one of those positions, I'd sort of like to have the historical context and understanding and even sort of the theory on what should guide you as you make that kind of advice. But this time, as I looked at Vietnam, I looked much more explicitly at how well we did at strategic leadership. And we might answer that or raise that point next. But again, most importantly, getting the big ideas right, getting the strategy right. And it really solidified my previous notion, or preconception, if you will, but really drove it home, that we didn't get the big ideas right in Vietnam for 13 years. We started somewhere around the mid-1950s, just providing security assistance and so forth. But it was essentially, keep in mind that the French had a seriously bad big idea. They were frustrated. They couldn't get the communist Vietnamese to fight them. They were acting as guerrillas. And so they decided, we'll build a huge base out in a place called Dien Bien Phu, out at the edge of our air power and so forth. And it'll be so attractive to them, they'll finally come to fight. We'll finally meet them in battle. Pay no attention to those hills that ring this base, which is down in the valley. They'll never get artillery up on those hills. They did. They took them apart piece by piece, carried them up with all the ammunition, laid siege to Dien Bien Phu, and to their horror ended up having to capitulate, went into captivity, Geneva agreement in Geneva, and they partitioned North and South Vietnam. We came in, we had the lessons of Korea fresh in our mind, which of course started with the North attacking the South, of course, not quite a demilitarized zone, but sort of a zone of demarcation. And when the Vietnamese, South Vietnamese, said, we have a problem with security in the villages and hamlets, could you help us with that? We said, no, we know what you need. You need to be worried about what we faced in Korea, which was an attack across the demilitarized zone. What you need is 9 divisions, which look just like ours. So this is 15 to 20,000 troops in each one, all the equipment, big stuff, everything else. Really the opposite of what you needed for local security, which really was the task that was facing them. And that always got second or third priority, if that. And then when we ultimately came in a much bigger way, starting in the early 1960s, first with advisors, then with main units in 1965, we decided to fight a war of attrition. Search and destroy was the kind of operative term. The body count was the metric, the enemy body count, and this was frankly wrong. We should have again focused on security of the people. Interestingly, the Marine Corps element there did, to the displeasure of General Westmoreland, and they actually had the metrics to show that they were actually winning, they were succeeding in what it was they were doing. It was not until late 1968, when General Abrams took command, that we finally shifted to much more of a comprehensive, integrated civil military counterinsurgency campaign to actually secure the people, who, after all, the people are the prize in irregular warfare, which was what this largely was. Yes, there were North Vietnamese units. Yes, you needed to fight them. Yes, you need to kill bad guys. Body count doesn't matter if they're the bad guys. But the indiscriminate use of air power, mad minutes they were called, massive use of dumb B-52 strikes and all the rest of this, often created more enemies than they took off the battlefield. And even when we won battles, the effect was very ephemeral, because we typically pulled out and the enemy went right into them. So we were not clearing and holding and building, and much of what we fought for was not of that great meaning. So without at all failing to acknowledge the incredible courage of our Vietnam veterans, who, by the way, never got the thanks that they deserved, never got the welcome home that they ensured the post 9/11 generation received on coming home. The determination, the sheer bravery that they exhibited, we had the wrong strategy. And by the time we got the right strategy, unfortunately, public support in the U.S. had already begun to dissipate very considerably, and it was just not possible to follow through. In fact, we might contrast Vietnam, which I felt really was unsustainable. I mean, we had to get out of Vietnam eventually, and ultimately the combination of Kissinger and Nixon figured out how to extract us, and yes, 2 years later it all collapsed, but they did get us out of something that we could not continue. In contrast, I believe, with Afghanistan, which was very sustainable. At the end, 3,500 troops, hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months. There was no reason we really had to pull out. However frustrated we were with the imperfect situation, to put it mildly. But I said publicly at the time that I feared that we would regret that decision, and I certainly believe that we have. For all of its shortcomings, it was vastly better than what you could see coming if the Taliban took control again. But maybe I can talk about strategic leadership, because we're going to frame everything. When I'm asked, what's the biggest takeaway that you hope a reader will emerge from the book with, I always talk about the strategic leadership intellectual construct that I developed between the 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq, actually used in each of the 4-star combat commands at the agency and elsewhere. And I should note, I've been in the private sector for over 10 and a half years. I'm a partner in one of the world's largest investment firms. We own over 120 companies, which often own many companies themselves, and then have minority interests in another 100. So I've actually been able to look at this in the civilian sector where it applies, or in the nonprofit sector, education, and so forth. You'll recognize this model, Madam President. But to succeed in war, to succeed in business, succeed in academia, as a leader, especially the leader at the very top. So we're now talking about the battlefield commander, the president, the CEO. You've got to perform 4 tasks superbly. You have to get the big ideas right. You have to understand the context. In conflict, it's your forces, the enemy forces, it's the physical terrain, it's the human terrain, it's all the elements of society, it's how a country is supposed to work, how it really works. It's the neighborhood, sanctuaries, and so forth. And then craft the right strategy, get the big ideas right. You then have to communicate the big ideas effectively through the breadth and depth of the organization the leader is privileged to command or lead. And everyone who has a stake in the outcome, which in the case of a commander and the surge in Iraq, it includes America's mothers and fathers. It includes not the White House, number 10 Downing, the Iraqi White House, includes all of our partners, et cetera, et cetera. Then you have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. That's the third task of a strategic leader. This is what we normally think of as leadership, by the way. This is the energy that the leader provides. You've seen it tonight in the President and Provost and the original speaker. It's the example the leader provides. It's the inspiration. It's attracting the best and brightest people absolutely possible, hanging on to them as long as you can, developing them, taking care of them forever, and bringing them back, of course, like Mike Meese, he can never get away. And then allowing those that aren't measuring up, on the other hand, to move on to something else. It's how the leader spends his or her time is crucial. We had a huge butcher block piece of paper for each of these commands that laid out what I did every single day of the week. It's 7 days a week. In combat, and very detailed schedules. You have huge staffs that can enable you to carry out all kinds of activities during the day, but what matters most are the critical meetings with the key individuals who are carrying out the lines of operation, the various sub-organizations and the efforts that they are taking. It's going out, seeing it for yourself. It's communicating back to those in the United States, other countries, and so on. And you have to work all that out. And even though it's a 24-hour-a-day job, sort of, there's just so many hours in the day, and you have to figure out where you're going to spend your time. And then it's the metrics. I already mentioned the body count was a flawed, it was the wrong metric. And then also it became increasingly lacking in integrity, which was another problem which undermined the culture. And then there's a fourth task that's sometimes overlooked, which is where the leader has to formally sit down, events on the battle rhythm that enable the leader to perform this task, or force him to in some cases. And you sit down and determine how you need to refine the big ideas as the context evolves, as you succeed, as you fail, as again, make progress, experience setbacks. You're constantly refining the big ideas and some of the small ideas, and then communicating it, overseeing it. And so it's a constant repetitive process. If you think about, by the way, that fourth task, think of Kodak, which actually it was the king of film, photography, and services, all aspects of it. It actually had 2,000 patents on digital photography, but it failed to make digital photography the new big idea. Others beat them to that, and they've never actually regained anything nearly what they had before, although they've certainly tried. So this is not easy. And I'll just, in addition to pointing out that it took us 13 years in Vietnam, I would contend that it took us about 9 years in Afghanistan to get the inputs right. So that's not just the big ideas, which my predecessor, General McChrystal, pretty much sorted out a year or so before I took command. But it's also the right organizational architecture. It's the right leaders. It's the right preparation of your forces. It's the right number of diplomats, development experts, spies, rule of law experts, financial forensics experts. Believe it or not, we always had a financial counterterrorism task force, and all the rest of that. So this is not easy stuff, but it does work in the private sector too. A great example I love is Netflix with Reed Hastings, one of the really great strategic leaders of our time, right up there with Jack Ma of Alibaba, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and so forth. And if you think of Netflix, it had, under his leadership, at least 4 different incarnations. The very first one, and I've discussed this with him, by the way, and I've also discussed this construct, and he has one very similar. So the first big idea for Netflix is we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. And so we're going to charge less than Blockbuster. We're going to undermine Blockbuster. And of course, ultimately, Blockbuster goes out of business. You know, there's one left in the continental United States, Bend, Oregon. It's a famously contrarian place. It refuses to allow its Blockbuster to die. And we can all, those of my generation, can take our grandkids out there and show them what we did on a Friday night. So anyway, but that's the first big idea. They communicate it, they oversee the implementation. He gets down here a couple of years later, how we doing? Well, Blockbuster's going out of business, but other people are doing what we're doing. There's always going to be competition very quickly. And he says, well, there's a change in the context. Broadband speeds are much faster. So the new big idea is going to be we're going to put movies in the hands of customers by having them download them. Great new big idea, so that they expand further, work it through. Third big idea, this is the real breakout moment. We're going to create our own content. $100 million on House of Cards alone, all the other iconic series that we binged watched during the early boring months of the pandemic and everything else. And then the fourth big idea was we're going to make major motion pictures. We're going to go head to head with the major studios. In fact, we're going to buy not 1, but 2 movie studios, and they do. And a great metric, 3 years or so ago, they got more Academy Award nominations than any other major motion picture studio. So really quite remarkable. Now, on that latter incarnation, I did sit with him one time, and I said, you know, that movie that had Brad Pitt playing General Stan McChrystal, again, my predecessor in Afghanistan, with him I spent 4 or 5 years in combat, in his Special Forces Command role in particular. I said, that just, you know, it just didn't work. I mean, Brad Pitt sort of marched around like a little wooden soldier. He salutes stiffly. He had no sense of humor. It just, again, and I said, beyond that, I just could not believe that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me. Anyway, so that's the model for strategic leadership, and so we lay this out very explicitly in the introduction. We actually put it in there originally, and then as we did all the chapters, we came back and said we need to sharpen this because this is what determines success or failure in many cases. Don't get me wrong; there's lots of other elements that will determine that. Including, you know, the nature of the enemy and their skill and determination, fortitude, etc. But generally, it is the performance of those 4 tasks superbly that gives you the very, very best shot, of course, at prevailing.
No, thank you very much. That's and I know Dr. Kress took notes on that, so I'm sure there'll be a big 4 for the rest of the provost. Yeah, General, you helped write the U.S. Army Doctrine on Counterinsurgency, and you discussed that topic at length in your book. How important is counterinsurgency in modern warfare?
Well, it still is very much one of the areas in which we need to maintain proficiency. One of the many failures in the wake of Vietnam, where we generally did quite well in going back and doing very searching analysis, and we recognized that individual replacement is a bad idea. You should use unit replacement. We recognized command tour lanes. Commanders were only staying in their job 6 months in Vietnam and then rotate to something else. So you're just constantly churning in all of this. Of course, they only had 1 year there typically as well. You had a drafty army. We went to a professional force. All of this was crucial, but we finally did learn a lot about the conduct of irregular warfare, which is really maybe even a better term than counterinsurgency. And we then consigned it all to the ash heap of history because we decided we never want to do this again. And so perhaps the best way never to do it again is not to be prepared for it and explicitly to set your force structure up so it's really hard to do. The problem with that is that, you know, the president doesn't ask you if you're ready to do something when a crisis arises. You're told to do it, but this is one of the reasons why we were not as prepared for what we ended up doing, particularly in Iraq. because that very quickly turned into an insurgency, in part because of some very bad big ideas that we made early on in that campaign. Remember, we had a pretty impressive campaign, topple Saddam and take Baghdad, topple the regime. I remember I did ask, by the way, in Kuwait, again, I was just a two-star, and they, at the final gathering of the commanders, I said, can you give us just a little more detail on what happens after we get to Baghdad and topple the regime? And the retired three-star said, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. And it didn't work out all that well. And so, first of all, that organization was disbanded. Secretary Rumsfeld was dissatisfied, creates a new ad hoc organization. And the very first action the new head of the Coalition Provisional Authority takes is to fire the entire Iraqi military without telling them how we're going to enable them to provide for their families. That's hundreds of thousands of military-aged, trained males with rifles whose stake is to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. That's a big mistake. And then compounded that by firing the entire Ba'ath Party. Well, okay, that's Saddam's party, I got it. And Saddam and his guys and a few levels down, but when you get to level 4, these are basically the bureaucrats that run a country that we didn't understand. And tens of thousands of them, many of them Western educated, quite secular as well. They're really what we needed to run the country. A lot of them drank. I mean, this is, what more could you ask for? Anyway, but we fired them all without an agreed reconciliation policy. Now, as Mike Meese recalls, I managed to get a reconciliation policy going in my own area with a special exception. It made all the difference in the world, except that at the end of my tour, they were all waiting and they undid what it was that we did. Counterinsurgency is still with us very much, and we've had a much better response this time after drawing down, reducing our forces in Iraq and of course, withdrawing from Afghanistan. We have kept the doctrine. We still maintain proficiency. We have specific organizations in the Army in particular called Security Force Assistance Brigades, which are designed essentially to perform these tasks. Because keep in mind, there's no question that the focus of the United States has to be on the most important relationship in the world, together with our allies and partners, and that is China. It's the Indo-Pacific region, far and away where we have to focus, again, on transforming our forces and all the rest of that. But we want to prevent that war. The wars we're actually fighting still are essentially what one would call irregular warfare, although we're doing it much more now as we are in Iraq, in Syria, against the Islamic State, Eastern Africa, a number of other places you're familiar with from your background, Ambassador. And then elsewhere in the world, we're generally doing advise, assist, and enable because we have a constellation of drones that we didn't have back in the day. So we've maintained proficiency. We're actually engaged in this around the world. And the truth is, the American public is generally okay with that as long as it doesn't cost too much. The big idea about sustainability of a war or a commitment is cost and in terms of blood and in terms of treasure. We have very few casualties in these. We're, again, advise, assist, enabling, not on the front lines with the exception of some counterterrorism operations. The irony is that in Afghanistan, in the final 18 months, we hadn't lost a soldier. We could have sustained that, I think, quite easily, $25 billion out of a $850 billion defense budget. So we need to maintain that proficiency. And in fact, the truth is, if we have any serving military, or certainly the retired military in here, I think the challenge for leaders in the military now is greater than at any time before, because you have to have proficiency all the way along the spectrum of conflict. We still obviously have to do support to civilian authorities. You have to do the lower end of activities. We're not doing that much. We're still heavily engaged in counterinsurgency, but in modest numbers. And then you have the preparation for what might be termed conventional warfare, and of course the real preparation to ensure that we can deter anything that might happen in the out in the Indo-Pacific. And keep in mind, deterrence, it's founded on two factors. It's the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand, and your willingness to employ them on the other. And one other theme in the book is don't ever forget that what happens in one part of the world reverberates in other parts. I remember the red line that was not a red line, and I was meeting with the prime minister of a country in Southeast Asia, and he said, you know, General, that reverberates out here. Frankly, the withdrawal from Afghanistan, many, I think, believe that that was one of the factors that Vladimir Putin took into account, thinking that he could probably do this and not get away without. And by the way, I should note, I'm totally non-political. I don't even register to vote. I haven't since I was promoted to 2 stars. I advise members of either party, but I don't support, contribute, or endorse candidates. So there's no political leaning here. Is trying to be objective as I can.
Yeah, understood. Now, when we were upstairs, I told you that following the first Iraq War, I went into Kuwait when the oil well fires were still burning.
Yeah.
So H.W. Bush said, let's stop before going into Baghdad. I want to just give you this. Karl von Clausewitz said, war is a continuation of policy with other means.
Politics by other means, I think, yeah.
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 Having said that, as someone who spent nearly 30 years in the world of diplomacy, I'm a big proponent of negotiations and dispute resolution
So are soldiers.
as a first option.
We know what happens if diplomacy fails. By the way, I actually went up at the request of Secretary of State repeatedly in uniform to testify on behalf of the Secretary of State before the whatever the subcommittee of appropriations deals with foreign
Senate Foreign Affairs.
and saying that, you know, similar to what Jim Mattis said quite famously, if you don't give us enough diplomats, you're going to have to give us more ammunition.
Yeah. But from your perspective, what is the role of diplomacy in conflict resolution? And can you touch on the need for diplomacy and warfare to work in concert?
Sure. Again, keep in mind that this was, as I said, a comprehensive, so civil military counterinsurgency campaign is what you need. And you're doing diplomacy all the time. The military commander is doing diplomacy by another name. Sometimes it might involve the full range of emotions, as occasionally I would tell my translator and Ambassador Crocker, look, I had, when I was privileged to command the surge, I think the finest diplomat of his generation, Ambassador Ryan Crocker, I think served as chief of mission, so therefore ambassador, I think in 6 countries at least I can count: Syria, Kuwait, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, maybe one other that I'm missing.
I work with Ryan when he was in the department.
Yep, just an extraordinary individual. And we decided that we would be joined at the hip. We would be like this all the time. Neither of us would ever meet the Prime Minister of Iraq without the other being there. Every week we did a video conference with the President of the United States and the whole national security team. By the way, President George W. Bush deciding on the surge, that's a huge idea. And he did that largely over the objection or despite the concerns voiced by the chiefs of the different services, the combatant commander, and arguably the individual on the ground at the time. And I remember he told me later that one of the service chiefs had said, you know, sir, this could break my service. And the President said, what'll break the service is losing a war. And I think he was very right. It was a very courageous commitment to provide additional forces when Iraq had gone so seriously into civil war. And then, you know, picked a new commander and a new ambassador. We decided we're going to be joined together. He was always doing diplomacy. I was supporting him. We would actually go to meetings. So the Prime Minister would always sit there. One of us would sit here. My translator would do the translating usually. And then the other of us would sit over there. We actually would change seats a couple of times because I'd say, okay, Prime Minister, that's all I have. We had an hour a month or hour a week with him, 2-on-1, and another hour in his National Security Council meeting. And then there were usually crises that required us, but we always went together. And he was constantly engaged in diplomacy and also being supported by the State Department and other agencies in the region. Conducting diplomatic initiatives. And of course, if you can resolve something peacefully, bring it on. We also created these provincial reconstruction teams that were at every brigade command and above headquarters, and they were populated ideally by diplomats and development experts. Unfortunately, we ran out of those, and so we went to the reserve components of the military, brought people over who had the right expertise, put them in civilian clothes, so people understood that they were provincial reconstruction, not just additional military officers. So you're doing all of this, and again, keep in mind that yes, security has to be established. Again, without security, all the rest of this can't be done. But the way you solidify security gains is by what you do that helps show the people that life is going to be better if you work with us instead of working with the enemy. It's the restoration of basic services. It's reconstruction of bridges, roads, schools, clinics, government facilities, all of this, restoration of electricity, of water. That's expertise way beyond what we brought, although I oversaw it as well. I did have the bigger staff, a much bigger staff, and had 165,000. Much bigger budget, a lot more aircraft. But we flew him everywhere he wanted. We secured him. We did, again, because he was crucial. Keep in mind, so the big ideas for the surge, which, by the way, were 180 degrees different from what we've been doing. People talk a lot about change management. You can't change any more than completely reversing what it is you've been doing. And by the way, it was over the objection of the Prime Minister, whose national security advisor came to me on day 3 and said, General, the Prime Minister has these demands. He laid them out. They were all the opposite of what we intended to do. And I said that if that's what he intends to do, I'd appreciate him telling the President tomorrow in the normally scheduled video conference. But he should know that if he does that, he's going to do it without me, because I'm going to be on the next plane to Washington and I'm going to take the policy with me. This is a big moment. Your blood is coursing through your body, but I knew what we needed to do. We had spent the previous 15 months distilling all these lessons, writing this manual, overhauling all the preparation of our leaders, forces, equipment, and then the rest of that, the road to deployment. We're ready to do this. And again, if he was going to block that, then that was when I needed to go to the President and say, we can't do it. And I never heard anything about it again. And we went on and did what we did. So the big ideas, and I wrote my own counterinsurgency guidance that we distributed to everyone. It was a series of admonitions. The first one was secure and serve the people. Security of the people is absolute job one. We can only do it by living with them. So we must live with the people as well, which complete reversal of what we'd been doing, which was pulling out of the neighborhoods, consolidating on big bases, getting ready to go home. We go back downtown, 77 additional locations just in the Baghdad area, which we had to fight for generally because we put our forces right where the Sunni Shia fault lines were most apparent, because levels of violence. You had metrics that could show you this, heat maps. Keep in mind that much of the country was in a Sunni Shia civil war. When you have 53 dead civilians due to violence every 24 hours in the nation's capital, that is not a good indicator. And so that was number one. Number two was that we were going to promote reconciliation. We cannot kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. We have to reconcile with as many of the rank and file as we can, not the leaders. And we did. We reconciled with about 103,000 ultimately, about 80,000 Sunni insurgents, again, low ranking, many of them just in the wrong place at the wrong time, getting in with the wrong crowd, and then 23,000 Shia militia. Third one is we're going to pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly with our special mission units every single night, 12 to 15 operations, and then usually more turning one on top of the other. And also, we are going to take back control from the Iraqi security forces to whom we had given it, because they'd been basically rendered combat ineffective by the rise in violence. But there was another one. We're going to have even more civil and military integration. We wrote a civil military campaign plan. The only time in life that I ever did that. I couldn't do it in Afghanistan because it was a NATO military operation. I had a U.S. ambassador, but I couldn't. It was really a coalition. This is a U.S.-led multinational force in Iraq. So the ambassador and I both signed it. I took heat from the Pentagon. Why do you have this civilian crap in your campaign plan? Well, because it's a civil military campaign plan. This is what we need to do. So It was huge. By the way, one of the other ones, we had a lot of these fun actually with these admonitions. One of them was walk, get out of your vehicle, take off your sunglasses. There was one that said promote initiative. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. But that's a mindset. You're also trying to create a culture of just get out there and do the right thing. Here's roughly what the commander at the top wants. You now translate that into action at your level outside the wire under body armor with Kevlar.
Okay. Let's pivot to Asia and focus on China's role on the international stage. In addition to flexing its economic muscle with the Belt and Road Initiative, China has begun flexing its military muscle by encroaching on Philippine territory and periodic overflights and military maneuvers around Taiwan. What are your thoughts on a policy of strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan and the United States intervention in the event of a PRC invasion?
Well, first of all, the strategic ambiguity is the overarching name, rubric, or whatever for our policy that really dates all the way back to the opening to China. There are these various communiques and other documents that we have agreed to, and every time you do anything, we recommit to the ex-communiques and to this, and also the Taiwan Relations Act in the U.S., which commits us legislatively to supporting Taiwan. What's interesting is that, remember I talked about the elements of deterrence, perception of your forces and your willingness to employ them. And to try to strengthen the latter, I believe that President Biden has said what he has said on 4 times. He appears to slip up, and I think it's not that case, where he says, yes, we will come to the aid of Taiwan. Then, yes, his national security advisor rushes out to the podium and says there's no change to our policy of strategic ambiguity. Again, the communiques of this, the that, Taiwan Relations Act. But I think that's actually thoughtful, because what the biggest of the big ideas about China is be firm, very firm, but not needlessly provocative. You just want to ensure that every day the sun comes up in Beijing, the leaders get up and look around and they look out toward Taiwan in the South China Sea and they say, okay, not today. And we just want that to keep happening day after day after day, noting that, yes, President Xi has told his forces to be ready for military operations by 2027. That's a reality. And again, we have to continue to transform our forces, harden our bases, disperse them, improve their defenses, put the headquarters underground, get that theater on a footing that is much more like that of, say, Central Command when I was privileged to command it, and we were overseeing 2.5 wars and the counter-piracy effort. So again, that's the nature of this. We would like, obviously, for that relationship, which is far and away the most important in the world, to be as mutually beneficial as is absolutely possible. But there are a lot of actions that have taken place that have made that very, very difficult. Wolf warrior diplomacy, economic coercion, killing Indian soldiers on the line of actual control in 3 different disturbances there, the actions around Taiwan, the actions around the Scarborough Shoal with the Philippines, et cetera, and that has made it very, very difficult. So that's the reality we're in. I learned as a CIA director, you have to deal with the world the way it is, not the way you'd like it to be, same as a diplomat. And that is where we are. I think in general, by the way, I would state that there's more continuity, there has been more continuity from the previous administration to the current administration on China than on any other subject. And it's largely, there are very few areas in which there's real bipartisan agreement on Capitol Hill, a fairly partisan location in our nation's capital. But there is agreement on what I've just described. And if anything, you see it, both parties almost competing with each other to be tougher on China. I think you have to be careful with that too, though. Again, you have to recognize that, as I think it's our Treasury Secretary has rightly said, we should de-risk, but you can't decouple. This is, the biggest trade relationship. We're China's biggest trading partner. They are our 3rd, always after Mexico and Canada, given the North American Free Trade Act, now USMCA. But they're the biggest trading partner for 120 countries in the world. And again, we've got to deal with that reality. So be firm, but not needlessly provocative.
Thank you. You know, many modern conflicts are with non-state actors such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb, Hamas, Hezbollah, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, and the Houthis. Do the actions of these non-state actors change a nation's approach in fighting an asymmetrical war?
Well, I think it depends on the nature of the conflict, frankly. You do what is necessary in response. This is, again, where you've got to really understand the strategic context. You have to understand your forces' capabilities, their capabilities, again, the neighborhood, what this is doing. And we're seeing that. I mean, people will occasionally say, we're fighting two wars right now. Can we actually do that and deter China? First of all, we're not fighting two wars. We're supporting Ukraine, which is fighting for its very survival, its war of independence. We're not fighting on that battlefield. We're providing substantial assistance, and I hope that Congress can get together and pass the additional authorization or appropriation that is so desperately needed for what I think is about as right versus wrong as it gets, a brutal, unprovoked invasion of a neighboring country ordered by a president, a kleptocrat who has a grievance-filled, revanchist, revisionist view of history. We are actually fighting the Houthis. Now, that's a very small operation, and I think we're doing that right. I think we're doing it in a measured way. We're doing it in self-defense, in defense of our interests, because, again, there's no authorization to conduct this operation. So this is not an Article 1. Congress hasn't authorized this, as they did the authorization to use military force in the wake of 9/11, which is still in force, still justifies our actions against Sunni extremist organizations and all related to Al-Qaeda and those that supported Al-Qaeda. So it has to be the Article 2, which is the President's Commander-in-Chief defending self-defense. And I think we're going about it reasonably skillfully. We're not going to be able to stop this entirely, but I think we can, over time, reduce their capability very considerably. And we're doing it in quite a precise way. It's again, I think, a real tribute to those who are doing this. But it's serious. It's 15% of the maritime traffic in the world. It doesn't have anywhere near the implications of freedom of navigation being disrupted in the Gulf. That would move markets big time, because it could potentially reduce the supply of crude oil and natural gas, and that will move. But keep in mind that Iran, who's behind all of these problems, behind Hamas as well, and Hezbollah and the Iraqi militias in the land of the two rivers, Syria, and the Houthis, their own oil gets out to the market through the Gulf, 1.5 million barrels-ish per day. That's a huge source of revenue for them, and they don't want to jeopardize that. I don't think they also don't want to get in a fight directly with us. They'd much rather fight to the last Houthi, the last Hamas terrorist, the last Lebanese Hezbollah fighter, the last Shia militia in Iraq.
Now, thank you, General. To stay on point and get you to your next appointment on time, this is the final question. As you noted, you have a special relationship with NOVA. In your book, you speak extensively about contributing heavily to the nation's counterterrorism and counterinsurgency strategies. Considering NOVA's academic community generates many of the men and women who will eventually serve in the government agencies and businesses integral to these strategies, what do you believe are the most critical skills or areas of knowledge on which students should focus to effectively navigate and contribute to our evolving global landscape, particularly in the context of international relations and conflict resolution?
That's a great question. To some degree, having taught economics in the past, you always begin by saying it depends. And it does. But I'm tempted to say that the most important qualities that one seeks are, in a sense, the basic educational skills. The ability to analyze, to think critically, to communicate effectively, orally, and in writing. I just actually got a book written by a woman who was 3 times. So again, you never get away. Once you get on Petraeus's bench, you're going to keep getting called. It was Jean Hull, who actually served in his department as well subsequently. Because you also take care of them. And I got her to Princeton, and of course she got a PhD and then taught in the Department of Social Sciences. But she worked for me when I was a 1-star, 2-star, and 3-star, Bosnia, Iraq, and Iraq. Brilliant woman. And she sent this book that she'd written, and she wrote in it, thanks so much for your mentorship over the years. You once said that life is a writing contest. And in a lot of ways it is. So now I don't want to in any way diminish the trades, STEM skills, all of these other skills. But I think there are some very basic skills. Anybody who's been in government knows, or in any business, frankly, you can never have too many smart people, and you never have enough people who can actually communicate effectively, who can write well, state the theme, tell them what you're going to tell them and tell them what you told them. It's actually hard to find that. So I hope there might be an English teacher in here, English professor, who feels a little bit of validation out of this, or a history professor or something like that, because of all the focus these days on, electrical engineering, or again, automotive, or whatever else. I think that those basic skills are awfully important. There are firms in New York, and again, I'm part of that community, have been now for over a decade, that actually don't look for the person who majored in economics with a minor in finance. They look for somebody who majored in philosophy, or, they can teach. You can teach finance, maybe even send them on to do an MBA in that. But if they don't have the very basic skills, it's pretty tough. And that's a pretty glaring absence.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, this concludes the Q&A portion of the program. Please join me in thanking General Petraeus for his service from a grateful nation, but also, too, for sharing this special moment with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you all.